You know, you work in this industry long enough, you start to feel things, right? Things start to weigh you down. That happens when it comes to threat detection and incident response, doesn't it? Any of you work in that area? Any of you look at log files, wade through the muck of data, trying to figure out what's important, what should I really take action on? It happens. We're flooded with data. We have a lot of tools that help us figure out what's meaningful, but we still have to look at that data. So that's our pain. Our pain is that when it comes to threat detection and incident response, we have perhaps to manually look at a lot of data just to figure out, am I in trouble and do I need to act on this? It's time consuming. It's going to delay our MTTX, right? Mean time to resolving a problem, identifying a problem, right? These are things that sometimes keep us up at night. All right, so what can we do? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this session. This session is really intended to start making you think about the possibilities. And I'm going to show you a working solution, something that I built. It's pretty simple, but it's just, it'll help you to unlock the door of what's possible. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a couple of AWS services. We're going to use Amazon EventBridge along with AWS Lambda. We're going to stitch these services together to automate a few things for me. Now, I'll preface this by saying that we kind of need to have some idea of what we're looking for, things that are important to us, like an EC2 cluster, right? We need to know that that's an important cluster to us and I want to protect it. So we need to have a little bit of information ahead of time. And then once we have that information, now we can start to formulate when something happens, what do I want to do? Okay? And so that's what I'm going to walk you through in this session. We're going to take a look at how EventBridge is really going to be sort of the pivotal piece that unlocks a lot of possibilities. EventBridge is integrated with 130 event sources. So it can bring information in, it can receive information, and then 35 targets. It can go do something. It can tell a target to do something for me. And that's a lot of fun. I'm gonna show you GuardDuty, but this works with a lot of other services. So Security Hub, Inspector, so on. The list goes on and on and on. Okay, so how are we going to accomplish this? What's this going to look like? All right, well, this is the architecture that I'm going to start out with. And in the architecture that I'm starting with, it's very simple. Like I said, we have an instance. We're going to call it compromised instance. It's not really compromised, right? This is just a demo. But that instance is inside of my initial security group, and it's inside of a public subnet, inside my VPC. And it's important enough to me that I know that if it's communicating with a host that's on a known threat list, I don't want that to happen. So that's what I'm going to look for, okay? And I have that malicious instance. I put it off there on the side. It's just sitting out there. We don't know what it's doing. We don't really care until it starts to talk to my compromised instance, okay? So here's what we're going to build with these services. What's going to happen is my malicious instance is going to talk to the compromised instance. Now remember, we don't want that to happen. At that point, GuardDuty is going to produce a finding for me. GuardDuty is going to say, hey, this is an unauthorized connection. At that point, EventBridge is going to receive the information from GuardDuty and say, oh, I have a target, and that target is a Lambda function. So it's going to invoke that Lambda function, and then my Lambda function is going to run some Python code that says, all right, we're going to take that compromised instance, and in this case, because I want to be quick and easy, we're just going to move it to a different security group. Now, we could change the network ACL, we could, snapshot it, we could do a lot of things, right? We'll just write that into our Python code. But for this example, we're just going to move it to another security group, illustrate that we can make a change, all right? So at this point, I'm just going to take you through some of the screens and sort of the process, and I'll share a couple of caveats that I ran into when I was working through this. Now, I'm showing you here the AWS console. I've also done this with Terraform, and boy, that makes it really easy to just reproduce. At the very end, I'll share a QR code. That QR code has a link to a workshop that I wrote where you can build this entire solution in your environment using Terraform. You can deploy it within a matter of a couple minutes, okay? And it even adds sending notifications through SNS, so you get emails letting you know that something happened, okay? All right, so that's where we're at. So let's go ahead and talk about what we need to do to make this happen. So the first thing is that we need to turn GuardDuty on. We've already got our instances deployed. We're going to turn GuardDuty on. And when we turn on GuardDuty, it's going to take us a little bit of time. GuardDuty needs to see things. You're going to get this splash screen. It's going to tell you, by turning GuardDuty on, you're letting GuardDuty see things in your account. It needs to be able to do threat detection. So when you agree to that, being able to see things like your VPC flow logs, your CloudTrail event logs, things like that, once it starts to be able to see this stuff, now it can generate findings and do what it does. So we enable GuardDuty here, and then once GuardDuty's enabled, we see a screen that has no findings. And we expect this, because like I said, it takes a little bit of time to build up that data. Okay, so one thing that I like to do is go into the settings for GuardDuty, and I make this little change for the frequency of updating the findings. So by default, GuardDuty can take its information, and those findings get sent, exported out to like EventBridge every hour. But I always move this down to 15 minutes. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just saying, you know what, let's make this a little quicker. Still going to take us a little bit of time. It's not like an immediate trigger, but it's going to speed things up. So I'm going to make that change here. And now GuardDuty's kind of ready. GuardDuty's a managed service. It's got all kinds of things it'll detect for us automatically. But remember earlier when I said that malicious instance is someone that's on a known threat list, and I don't want it talking to someone on a known threat list? For my demonstration, I need to create that threat list to make it trigger the finding for me in this case, right? So that's what I'm going to do next. I just wanted you to see what I did was I created a text file on my local machine. I copied the address of that malicious machine, and I put it into that text file, and then I uploaded it to an S3 bucket. So now I've got a threat list in an S3 bucket with an IP address that GuardDuty can compare findings against and say, hey, is this someone I can talk to or not? Okay, so with that, I go back into my GuardDuty interface. I go to lists. I go down to the bottom. Now, there is a trusted IP list. That's at the top. I'm not worried about that one right now, but if you want to make sure that certain addresses are trusted, you put them in the list at the top. The ones that you want to make sure are blacklisted, that you don't trust, you put them in the bottom. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'm adding a threat list, and when I add a threat list, I need to tell it where it's at. That's why I put it in the S3 bucket. I said, okay, go look at my S3 bucket. It's all in the same account, so I'm not leaving my account to go look at a list. I'm staying right within my AWS account. GuardDuty is simply looking at the S3 bucket, looking at that text file, and checking the IP address that's on it. So I add this list, and then there's one little thing here that you have to do, or you're going to be waiting a long time to get results. You have to check that little box that says active. So that's what I did. I checked the box. As soon as that threat list is active, now I can use it. All right, so now I've got an active threat list, I've got GuardDuty enabled, and it's going to be taking its findings when it produces some, and it's going to be sending them out to EventBridge. So we wait about 15 minutes. And after that, we have a finding. Woohoo, right? This is what I was looking for. I got a finding. This is telling me it's an unauthorized access EC2 malicious IP caller .custom. It's custom because it's from the threat list that I defined, okay? If I take a look at more details of this finding, I get a finding ID, I can scroll down here on the right-hand side and I can see the resource that's affected, all kinds of information. This is great. GuardDuty does good things like this for us. But again, this goes back to our pain is if I have more than just one finding, am I going to go click? Is this important? Who was the target? Okay, next one, click. Is this it, right? So this takes time to figure out, right? So we could do a couple of things if we wanted to do the investigation. We can investigate with detective. There's a link right there at the top. And that's just one option for us. But like I said, we already know because this was on the custom list that we don't want it to happen. So we don't need to investigate if this occurs. So we can write some automation that says, if this ever turns up in GuardDuty, just go do this. I don't need to look at it, all right? So we're going to do that with a Lambda function. So we go create the function next, right? That sounds like a good one. That's what should be next, right? We want that function to fire off. We got to do a little bit of pre-work first. The Lambda function is going to make changes to my AWS environment. It's going to take an EC2 instance in one security group and move it to another. It's also going to need to look at my instances, figure out what the instance ID is, figure out what the security group ID is. So it needs to have some permissions to be able to do that when it gets invoked. And if I don't give it the proper permissions, then even if GuardDuty sees it, Lambda is not going to do anything about it. It's going to try, but the permissions will not exist. They won't be enough to accomplish what I need. So I need to create an IAM role and a policy that says when Lambda is invoked, it's allowed to go do this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and create a role. This is an IAM, and it's for an AWS service, and we have an option to select Lambda. That's kind of right in the middle there. And it sort of builds the framework for me, and then from there, I can write my policy. Now, this is just showing you the policy that I use. It's written in JSON. There's a visual editor for that as well if you wanted to use that. And if you want to know more about IAM policies, there's a couple of sessions that happened here today, and I know they're recorded, so it'll give you a kickstart, right? But this has given me all of the allow permissions that Lambda is going to need to be able to make that change for me. Okay, so I'm going to save this as I called it GD Lambda policy, and I'll click on create policy, and there's the policy now with the permissions that I need. All right, so everything's good. So I have the policy, now I'm going to create the role. I give the role a name, and you can see sort of in the middle there that it shows that policy, GD Lambda policy, attached to the role. So I have a role that Lambda can assume when it makes the changes, and that policy is going to allow it to do that. So I create the role. Now we create the Lambda function. When I go create the Lambda function, I am going to create this from scratch. And so I give it a name, and I like Python. I'm going to use Python. And I'm going to pick the role that's down here at the very bottom. You can kind of see it in this line right here, that GD Lambda role that I just created. So that's going to give it the permissions when it gets invoked. And then I'm going to drop my Python code into my code source. If you want this code, it's in the workshop that I have the link for at the end. right? You're free to mess around with it. But essentially what this code is going to do is it's going to look at that GuardDuty finding, the information that comes from EventBridge when we have a match. It's going to look at that and it's going to say, okay, is this an instance I care about? And if the answer is yes, then it's going to say, all right, here's the security group I want to move it to. That's all I did in this code. So for the Python code to know that, I have to create a couple environment variables. So I have forensic security group, and I plugged in the ID there, and the instance ID of the instance I want to protect, and I plugged it in there. And that'll get read in by the code when it does its comparison to the finding that's produced. Okay, so now I have my environment variables. What else do we need? See, we're stitching things together here for this overall solution. I have my Lambda function. I have GuardDuty turned on. I still need that bridge in the middle that's going to take the GuardDuty finding and invoke the Lambda function. I need to create the EventBridge rule. The EventBridge rule, I'll go ahead and create that. I'm just going to go to Amazon EventBridge. I'm going to click on Create Rule. I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to use an event pattern. And so I'm going to scroll down on step 2, build the event pattern. I'm going to scroll down all the way to the bottom, and down on the bottom, I'm going to put my event pattern in. And what you'll notice is in this event pattern, it's looking for unauthorized access EC2 malicious IP caller .custom. That's the pattern I'm looking for. If you get a finding that comes from GuardDuty with this event pattern, if this is what's called, then you would match this pattern. And of course, I said the source is that this information's coming from GuardDuty. So now I have my event pattern. Now I need to tell it what to do when I see that event. Here's my target. My target is an AWS service. It's a Lambda function, and it's whatever I called the function. It's in a drop-down, and your function's already created, so it'll be in the list. Okay? So I create that function. Now I have my rule, my EventBridge rule. It's enabled, and now I'm just waiting to get data to come in from GuardDuty. Okay? This is just showing you that you can go in and look at that event pattern. I think I already showed you this screenshot. But the event pattern's there and the target is there. You just click through those tabs. All right, now we monitor. So we can monitor from the function. So going back into Lambda, if we're in the function, we can go to the little monitor tab there, and you can see the little dots showing when it was invoked. That's on the far left there of your screen. Right? And if there were any errors or successes, we'll get that as well. So that's one place we can monitor to see if our function's being invoked. We can also go look at our CloudWatch logs. So it'll create a log group. I can go in here and I can expand it, and I can look at everything that it tried to do when it ran that Python code from the function. And then, of course, in the EventBridge rule, I have a monitoring tab, and it also shows me if that EventBridge rule has been invoked. So I have a couple of places where I can check to see if this is doing what I expected. So in this case, in the screenshots I've shown you, it has been invoked. So the next thing for us to do, if it's been invoked, is to go see if it worked. So I go into my EC2 instances, I go to my compromised instance, I go down to my security tab, and now I can see down on the bottom left there, I'm in the forensic security group. I started out in the initial security group, it's been moved, it did exactly what I needed it to do. So this is cool, right? It's a starting point. This is just one example of how we can stitch services together to automate actions in my AWS environment. But there's endless possibilities. So like I said, this session was not about every single detail and click and watch the mouse move of setting that up. I'll give you all of the screenshots there, but the workshop will let you do it on your own. The workshop also gives you the Terraform code and the Python code, but it's about the possibilities. Think of all the sources of data that you can get into EventBridge and the 30-some targets where you can go and automate functionality. I have a list of resources here just to give you an idea. I only picked 5. The first one up there is my workshop link. I wasn't sure if these slides are going out or not, so if they are, it's here. But the additional reference links, some other things that you can do. There's one on GuardDuty and network firewall. So again, same thing. Network firewall, we make an adjustment to our firewall rules instead of a security group, right? We block traffic. Security Hub and EventBridge, and taking information from Security Hub and doing something. Inspector and containers, right? Again, different things. Get things from Inspector, information from Inspector, go do something with my containers. AWS WAF, right? So not exactly network firewall, but my web application firewalls. See something, make a change in my WAF rules. And then finally, the last 2 links that are in here are changing network ACLs and security groups. Actually, those are not changing them. They're detecting a change to my network ACL or my security group, and then we go do something. Yes, config can do that, but just another example of how we can use these services together. So I hope you found this useful, maybe inspiring. Now you're starting to think, what can I go do? Because there's a lot of possibilities. Thank you for being here. I'm Brandon Carroll. I'm a developer advocate at AWS. If you scan that QR code, at the very bottom, it's going to have the link to the workshop and all my contact information. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'll be around. And again, thank you.